At NBC, the new kids are doing their best to cover a major war on their first day's broadcast.
Chet Huntley, NBC News, New York.
And David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
There were no satellites. We had black and white film when we had any film at all. Quality was terrible. The sound was terrible. Picture quality of the television was not very good either. And so, as I say, we dealt with the story with a map, and Huntley or me, I don't remember, was talking. Map here, us here. It wasn't very exciting.
I don't know that anybody else did any better, but it is part of my firm memory that October 29, 56, the first Huntley-Brinkley news report, was the worst network television news broadcast in the history of the medium.
And there is something else memorable about that night. A new phrase enters our cultural consciousness. It comes at the end of the program.
Good night, David.
Good night, Chet.
And good night for the staff of NBC News.
We both despised it. I thought it was silly and said so. And we argued all day, maybe longer than a day, because I thought we should say good night to the audience, not to each other. Two men saying good night to each other on the air struck me as being a little dubious. So we both resisted. Finally, Reuben, by strength of character, personality, and intelligence, just forced it on us. So we did it, not liking it for 1 minute.
Seaborne invasion as seen through the combat cameras of the French army.
2 days after Israel invades Egypt, Britain and France send in troops, and the extent of the deception is now clear. Anthony Nutting was a British Minister of State.
And we and the French would go in to stop the war, put out the fire, oh, here we are on the Suez Canal. How extraordinary. British and French troops in occupation. That was what was finally done, which of course involved everybody telling lies through their teeth to the House of Commons, to the French Parliament, and to the United Nations. And, of course, which was what particularly angered Eisenhower, to the Americans.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Determined to stop the fighting, Eisenhower appeals to the United Nations, calling for the first ever emergency meeting of the General Assembly.
There can be no peace without law. And there can be no law if we were to invoke one code of international conduct for those who oppose us and another for our friends.
It works. The UN sends a peacekeeping force to Suez. The invaders withdraw their troops, humiliated. Britain and France are finished as powers in the Middle East. Israel and Egypt will growl at each other for years to come. Come back to the fall of '56, to the downfall of Free Hungary, and to a very small, very important measure of Hungarian revenge at the Olympic Games.
Our World continues in a moment.
In 1956, for the first and only time, the Summer Olympics is held in the Southern Hemisphere, which is why it is held in November, which still isn't summer, but it is spring down under, and that is close enough. In Australia, at the Games, this torch is meant to be a symbol of unity among nations. But another symbol will interfere, this flag, the flag of Hungary, with a hole where the communist hammer and sickle used to be. Freedom fighters cut it out. Freedom fighters flew this flag over Budapest. And now in Australia, freedom fighters will remember and act.
The elation in Hungary after the Russian soldiers left was short-lived. When Nikita Khrushchev pulled his troops out, he apparently bent to the new government's demand for a diminished Soviet presence in Hungary. He bent, but he did not break. And when that new government wanted to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact alliance, Khrushchev said, in effect, this freedom nonsense has gone far enough. And he sent in the tanks.
Attention, attention. This is Free Kossuth Radio Budapest. In the early hours of the morning, Soviet troops had started an attack against the Hungarian capital.
A young actor from our theater, he was running over to our house because we lived across the street from the theater where I worked. And he was running at 4 o'clock in the morning. He was knocking on the door, and he says, "The Russian troops are back. They are back. Go to the cellar."
Our troops are engaged in battle with the Soviet forces.
Andrei Marton, the Associated Press correspondent in Budapest.
We were at home. I ran to the telephone to call the Associated Press in London. I reached the operator, and I gave her, I said, "Connect me to London, this number." She was crying on the telephone. "I can't connect you anymore. I can't." That's what she said.
It is all over in 3 days. Tens of thousands of people are killed, Russians and Hungarians, soldiers and civilians. Here at home, there are demonstrations for Hungary, and broadcasts on Radio Free Europe lead many Hungarians to believe we will help. But according to Vice President Richard Nixon, the president sees nothing to do.
And the situation was that the Soviet Union had overwhelming conventional superiority in the area. So what is our answer to Hungary? To bomb Moscow? Eisenhower had to make that decision and decided that it would not be credible for him to threaten to do so.
Doing nothing does not cost Eisenhower the election. On November 6th, just 48 hours after the Soviet invasion of Hungary, while that story and the story in Suez are still fresh in our minds, we go to vote. The president votes in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The challenger, Adlai Stevenson, in Libertyville, Illinois. But the challenge is not successful. The president remains president. The new computer says so.
Unencumbered by free elections, not needing to take his case to the people, Khrushchev is flexing his muscles. Just 2 weeks after Hungary has been squelched and with the Allies muddling through Suez, Khrushchev makes his most famous challenge during a reception in Moscow attended by Western diplomats. The translation read by actor Rod Steiger.
We are Bolsheviks. We stick firmly to the Lenin precept. Don't be stubborn if you see you're wrong, but don't give in if you're right. It doesn't depend on you whether or not we exist. If you don't like us, don't accept our invitations and don't invite us to come to see you. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you.
That November, during the Australian spring, the 1956 Summer Olympics begin in Melbourne.
I declare open the Olympic Games of Melbourne, celebrating the 16th Olympiad of the modern era.
The Doves of Peace are a symbol of the only Olympic Games ever held in the Southern Hemisphere, as they are for all Olympics. The torch is another symbol. Rarely do the symbols mirror the real world. The Hungarian athletes had left home thinking they would represent a new, free Hungary. En route, they were asked to change their allegiance. Nick Martin was on the water polo team.
So we had a short meeting, and we decided that we would represent the devil itself just to get out of there. And so we did. And the first thing we did was to tear off the communist flag at the Olympic Village and replace it with the flag of a Hungary which no longer existed at that time.
In the Olympic Village, the souvenir swapping and normal fraternization among the athletes went by the boards when Hungarians and Russians met. Al Order, the American discus thrower who won the first of his 4 Olympic gold medals in Melbourne and is now in training for 1988, remembers the tension.
The only time I really saw conflict between the Hungarians and Soviet athletes when, 2 Hungarians and 2 Soviets would be approaching one another on a sidewalk, and who would move? And what I saw was the Hungarians would move, but before they would do so, they would spit on the sidewalk.
Water polo is thinly disguised combat under the most friendly conditions. When the Hungarians and Soviets met in Melbourne, less than a month after their countrymen fought a war, the combat was not disguised at all. Ervin Zador was on the Hungarian team.
We went into the Russian game, and we decided that this is for everybody, the people at home, for ourselves, and for the Russians.